This tea. I sat outside that door for 3 minutes. Not because I wasn't ready to go in, but because what I just heard from inside had torn apart everything I'd ever believed to be true. Her voice, the voice of the woman who had married my son 3 hours earlier, was still ringing in my head like metal clanging together. She looks like a maid in a suit. 67 years old. My whole life has been dedicated to that boy. And this is the result. If you think you know where the story is going, stay, because you don't know. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. Watch until the end, because the ending is the part you need to hear most. The morning of Caleb's wedding, I woke up at 4:47 a.m. Not because of an alarm, I hadn't set one. I woke up the way I always did before the most important days of my life. Suddenly, completely, like my body refused to waste a single second of something that mattered. I lay still for a moment in my small bedroom in the house on Dunmore Street, the same house I'd lived in for 31 years, the same ceiling I'd stared at through every hard night, every proud morning, every in-between. The early dark was soft and quiet. Through the window, I could see the first grey beginning of dawn, pressing up from the horizon. Somewhere outside, a bird was already singing. I remember thinking that felt like a good sign. I was 67 years old. My hands had already started aching before I got out of bed. They always did now, especially in the mornings, especially when the weather was shifting. I'd developed arthritis in my left index finger 2 winters ago, and some days it swelled up enough that I couldn't close my fist properly. Most people don't realize what that means for a seamstress. Your hands aren't just tools. They're the whole operation. They're the thing between the idea and the finished garment. When they start going on you, a part of your whole professional identity goes with them. But that morning, I flexed my fingers slowly under the covers, felt the familiar stiffness and pushed through it the way I always did. There was too much to do, too much to feel proud of. I got up, shuffled to the bathroom, and looked at myself in the mirror for longer than I usually allowed myself. I looked tired. That was just the truth. My face had settled into itself over the decades. The deep lines around my mouth, the grey at my temples that I'd stopped fighting years ago, the softness under my jaw. I looked like a woman who had worked hard and slept inconsistently and cried more than anyone knew about. I looked like a woman who had raised a son alone from the time he was 4 years old, who had taken in alterations until midnight and driven 40 minutes each way to work at a bridal shop in Greenfield for almost 2 decades, who had skipped her own vacations and her own dental work and her own new winter coat more times than she could count. But I also looked like a woman who was about to watch her son get married. I smiled at myself. I actually did that. Just stood there in my bathroom at 5 in the morning and smiled at my own reflection, a little self-consciously, like I was practicing for the day ahead. You did good, I told myself out loud. Whatever else happens today, you did good. The dress had taken me 11 weeks. That's the part people don't understand when I tell this story. They hear, she made a dress for the wedding, and they picture an afternoon project, some hobby quilting, something sweet and small. They don't picture 11 weeks of work on top of a full schedule, with hands that ached every morning, in a living room converted into a sewing space with bolts of fabric propped against the couch, and spools of thread in every color organized in an old wooden box my mother had given me 40 years ago. I had designed it myself, not from a pattern, from scratch. I knew my measurements better than any tailor alive, and I had decided very specifically that I wanted to wear something I had made, because that was who I was. That was the thing I was bringing to this day. Not a designer label, not an expensive boutique purchase. Myself, my craft. 67 years of learning how to make something beautiful out of raw material. The fabric was a deep, dusty rose, not quite blush, not quite mauve, somewhere in between. A silk-adjacent polyester that draped beautifully and didn't wrinkle easily. I had spent 3 weekends just getting the bodice right. The back had subtle pleating that I was genuinely proud of. The hem fell just below the knee. It was elegant without being showy. It was exactly the kind of dress a woman wears when she wants to be noticed, but not in a way that upstages anyone. I had been careful about that. I had been deliberately, consciously careful. I had also made a small matching clutch purse, hand-stitched along the seam, with a simple silver clasp I'd ordered online. It had taken me an extra 4 evenings. I didn't have to do it. I wanted to, because this was Caleb's day, and I wanted to show up to it as my best self, the self I was proudest of. I should tell you about Caleb. Caleb James Brooks. Born March 14th, 3 weeks early, in a hospital room I was in alone, because his father had already left 6 months before, and there was no one else to call at 2 in the morning who could get there fast enough. He came out screaming and red-faced, and the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. The nurse put him on my chest, and I fell apart in the best possible way. I fell completely apart, and then I put myself back together around him like he was the new center of gravity. I named him Caleb because I had always loved the sound of it. Strong but not aggressive, steady, like someone who would always find his way back. For the first year, we lived in a 2-room apartment with a shared laundry in the basement, and a neighbor who played music too loud on Friday nights. I was 28 years old and making $14 an hour, doing alterations for a dry cleaners. I had no family close by. My mother was in Tennessee. My sister was dealing with her own crises, and his father had made it perfectly clear he was not part of the picture. So it was me and Caleb. We figured it out. That's the honest summary. We figured it out one day at a time, 1 week at a time, 1 year at a time. I got better work. I took online classes in pattern making. I saved enough to rent a small studio space for 2 years before I realized working from the house was more efficient and cheaper. When Caleb was in middle school, I started doing custom wedding gowns on top of my regular alteration work, and that changed everything. Wedding gowns were slow, detailed, emotional work, the kind of work I was made for. Brides would come to me with photographs and ideas, and sometimes just a feeling they were chasing, and I would turn it into something they could wear on the most important day of their lives. I understood the weight of that. I always took it seriously. Caleb grew up watching me work. He'd do his homework at the kitchen table while I was at the machine in the living room. We'd talk over the noise of the motor, about his day, about his teachers, about whatever book he was reading, or game he was playing, or problem he was turning over in his head. He was a thoughtful kid, quiet in a way that made other adults underestimate him, and made me love him even more fiercely. He noticed things. He remembered things. When he was 11, he brought me a cup of tea one evening without me asking, set it next to my machine, and said, "You've been at that for 4 hours, Mom. You need to stop for a minute." I cried about that later when he was asleep, not from sadness, or from the particular overwhelm of watching a child become a person, a real, kind, perceptive person. I told myself that was the work I was proudest of, not any dress I ever made. Him. He had met Vanessa at a work conference in Atlanta. He was 34, she was 31, and by the time he called me to say he was seeing someone seriously, they had already been together for 8 months. I should be honest about my first impressions, because this story deserves honesty. The first time I met Vanessa, I drove down to Atlanta for a weekend. Caleb had moved there 3 years earlier for a project management job with a tech company. He had a nice apartment in Midtown, a lease on a sensible car, a life that looked put together and adult in ways I had worked very hard to make possible. I was proud of that, even if the distance was hard. Vanessa was pretty in a precise, deliberate way. She wore her hair in a sleek, natural style, kept her clothes immaculate, and spoke in the kind of measured, articulate sentences that made everything she said sound like a presentation. She worked in marketing. She was good at it, I could tell. She knew how to control the atmosphere of a room. She was friendly to me in a way that felt professional rather than warm, like I was a client she was managing, like she had prepared for the meeting. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself that I was just nervous and she was nervous and first meetings are awkward and I needed to give it time. I told myself this with great conviction for the next 2 years, right up until the morning of the wedding. But there had been moments, small ones, the kind that slide under your skin without you being able to name them right away. A comment about Caleb's background that lingered strangely in the air. A silence when I talked about my work that felt like something more than just disinterest. The way she would sometimes redirect conversations, gently, smoothly, with that professional ease of hers, so that the topic moved away from anything that pointed back to me. The way she called me Mrs. Brooks, even after I'd asked her 3 times to use my first name. Caleb seemed happy. That was the thing that kept me in check. When I saw the two of them together, he lit up in a way that was different from anything I'd seen in him before. He laughed more. He seemed settled. And I wanted that for him. I wanted it so badly that I was willing to push down every uneasy instinct in my body and just show up with a smile. That was the deal I made with myself. Smile, show up, be what he needs you to be. The engagement had been 18 months long, and in those 18 months I was invited to exactly 2 planning conversations. I found this out gradually, the way you find most painful things out. Not in one blow, but in a slow accumulation of small realizations. I had assumed I would be part of planning the wedding in some capacity, not in charge, not demanding, just included, the way mothers typically are, but the calls came less often than I expected. The questions weren't really questions. They were announcements dressed up in question form. We're thinking of doing this. Isn't that nice? The kind where the decision has already been made and you're just being informed of it politely. I made the dress and didn't tell anyone. I didn't want it to become a thing. I just wanted to show up wearing something I had made, and when people asked, I would say simply, I made it. And that would be my contribution to the day. Quiet and personal. 2 months before the wedding, Vanessa called to discuss what the mothers of the groom were wearing. The mothers, plural, because Caleb's father had long since remarried, and his wife, a woman named Patricia, who I had never met, would apparently be attending in that capacity, which was its own complicated thing that I had decided to set aside. I just want to make sure we're coordinated, Vanessa said in that smooth, careful voice of hers. The color palette is blush, ivory, and sage. We're hoping the family members will stay within those tones. That's perfect, I said. I'm actually already working on something in that palette. Oh, you're making your dress. There was a quality to the pause that followed, just a fraction of a second too long. That's lovely, she said. Very you. I heard the tone. I told myself I was imagining it. I was not imagining it. The wedding was at 2 in the afternoon at a venue called Willow Crest Estate, a converted antebellum property about 40 minutes outside Atlanta, with Spanish moss on the oak trees and a white rail terrace where the ceremony would take place. It was beautiful, expensive, the kind of place you rent when you want the photographs to look a certain way. I had planned to arrive by noon to have time to freshen up and be present before the ceremony. I had rented a car. My usual car was due for a brake inspection, and I hadn't wanted to risk the drive. And I had the address saved on my phone and the route memorized. What I had not planned for was the rental car agency giving away my reservation. I stood at the counter for 22 minutes while the young man behind the desk apologized in rotating circles and offered me a minivan that smelled like a pine air freshener and wet dog, or else a wait of 45 minutes for a sedan to come back in. I took the wait. While I waited, I called Caleb. No answer. I texted him. No reply. I called the venue's main line to let them know I might be slightly delayed. I got a voicemail message. By the time I was in the car, a mid-sized sedan that was not the car I booked but was at least clean, it was 12:45. The ceremony was at 2. 40 minutes away. I would be cutting it close, but I would make it. Except There was also, inexplicably, a traffic backup on I-285 due to a fender bender that had everyone funneled into one lane for 3 miles. I sat in that traffic and breathed. Deliberately, slowly, I told myself it was fine. I told myself I would be there in time. I turned on the radio and listened to an oldie station play a song from 1987 that I hadn't heard in years, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt something loosen in my chest, something simple and almost happy. I arrived at Willowcrest Estate at 1:52, 8 minutes before the ceremony. I parked crookedly in the overflow lot, grabbed my clutch, straightened my dress against the car window to check for wrinkles, and half walked, half jogged toward the main building in my block-heeled shoes, which were sensible enough to move in but not designed for a woman of 67 to cover ground quickly. The estate grounds were gorgeous and already arranged. White chairs in neat rows on the terrace, flowers everywhere, soft music floating from somewhere. Most guests had already been seated. An usher at the entrance looked at me with that particular expression people have when they are professionally required to be pleasant, but are also clearly assessing whether you are a problem. "I'm the mother of the groom," I said. He found my name on his list and directed me to a seat in the second row. I had been assigned the second row. I didn't say anything. I found my seat and sat down and focused on breathing normally. First row, second row. It didn't matter. I was here. I was present. The sun was warm and the flowers were beautiful, and in 8 minutes I was going to watch my son get married. I focused on that. The ceremony was 37 minutes long. Caleb cried when he saw Vanessa. I know because I was watching him, not her, when she came down the aisle. That's what you do when it's your child. You watch their face. And his face crumpled in that sweet, unguarded way that took him back to 6 years old for just a second. And I felt my throat close up completely, and I thought, there he is. There's my boy. I did not cry. I don't know why. I had expected to. Maybe it was the rush of the arrival, the adrenaline of the scramble, the seat assignment, the vague unease that I'd been carrying in my chest since I walked in, and realized I didn't know where to put my hands or my eyes in a space that somehow felt like everyone else's event and not mine. Or maybe I was already bracing for something. The body knows things before the mind admits them. After the ceremony, the guests were directed to a large reception hall inside the estate while the wedding party took photographs on the grounds. I found a glass of water and stood near a window and waited. I had told myself I would find Caleb after photos and hug him and tell him how proud I was and give him his gift, a card with a letter I had spent 3 weeks writing, and inside the card a check, not a small check, the kind of check that had required me to do some careful rearranging of my accounts, because I wanted it to mean something, and because I was his mother, and because I didn't know how else to say all the things I felt. What I had not anticipated was how long the photographs would take, or how the crowd would reorganize itself around family clusters I wasn't part of, or how the room would fill up with Vanessa's family and friends. A large, loud, beautiful group who all seemed to know each other with the easy intimacy of people who had been in each other's lives for years, and how I would end up standing slightly to the side of all of it, in my handmade dusty rose dress with my matching clutch, not quite knowing where to anchor myself. A woman named Gloria, one of Vanessa's aunts, was kind to me. She found me by the water station and introduced herself and asked how I was holding up and complimented my dress. I told her I had made it myself. She was genuinely impressed, held my wrist and turned me gently so she could see the back, asked about the fabric, the technique. It was the best conversation I had at that entire reception, and it lasted about 7 minutes before the photographer called her over. After that, I was alone again. At some point, Caleb's father arrived with Patricia. I had not known he would be there. Caleb hadn't mentioned it, or if he had, I had not retained it. And the sight of that man, 25 years older and considerably heavier, walking into the room with a woman on his arm, was a particular kind of jolt I hadn't prepared for. He saw me. He nodded. I nodded back. That was the sum total of our interaction. The dinner seating had me at a table near the back, not the back, but not the family table. A mixed group, some co-workers of Caleb's, a cousin of Vanessa's, who was quiet and clearly somewhere else in her mind. A couple I didn't know, who seemed to be friends of friends. I sat. I smiled. I made conversation about the flowers and the venue and the food, which was genuinely very good. I was polite and present, and I kept everything on the surface because the surface was safe, and underneath the surface I was already quietly struggling with something I couldn't fully name. It was during the cocktail portion, about an hour in, when I made the mistake that led to everything. I needed to use the restroom, which I had been told was inside, down the main hallway, second door on the left. I walked inside, found the hallway, found the first door, which was not the restroom it turned out, but a small bridal suite where Vanessa and her bridesmaids had been getting ready earlier in the day. The door was slightly ajar. I would have walked past it. I was about to walk past it, and then I heard Vanessa's voice. She was inside. I could tell she'd stepped back in to touch up something, maybe reapply lipstick or fix her hair. One of her bridesmaids was with her, a woman I'd seen earlier named Diane, who'd been in the wedding party. She showed up late, Vanessa was saying. Her voice was light, almost amused. The voice of someone recounting a mildly entertaining story. 8 minutes before the ceremony. Oh no. Diane's voice, sympathetic but also a little entertained. And the dress. A pause, a small sound that was not quite a laugh. She made it herself. Caleb mentioned she was going to, and I thought, okay, that could be sweet. But Diane, it looked like something from a church rummage sale. She looked like someone's grandmother who makes crafts. I stopped moving. That's mean, Diane said, but she didn't sound like she entirely meant it. I'm not being mean, I'm being honest. She's exactly what I expected, honestly. She's a very simple woman. A seamstress from wherever. She means well, I think, but she's not exactly. Another pause, a searching one. She's not really someone you put in the front row of your wedding photos, you know? There was a silence. Then Diane said, "Does Caleb know you feel this way?" "Caleb loves his mother," Vanessa said, and her voice had shifted, softer now, more controlled. And I respect that, I do. But he also understands that we have a certain image to maintain, a certain, she seemed to search for the word, circle, and she's just not part of that world. She never will be. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. My hand was resting against the wall. I became aware of it because I could feel the texture of the wallpaper, some kind of embossed damask pattern, raised and geometric under my fingertips. I focused on that texture. I pressed my fingertips against it slowly, one at a time, the way you do a breathing exercise, the way I had learned to do when the anxiety got too big to carry all at once. She's not really someone you put in the front row. I thought about the bodice, the 3 weekends I spent getting the pleating exactly right. I thought about the matching clutch, the silver clasp, the 4 extra evenings it had taken. I thought about the check and the card in my purse. I thought about the letter I had written and rewritten until the words felt like the truest version of what was in me. I thought about a Tuesday night in 1994, when Caleb was 4 years old and running a fever of 102, and I had no insurance and $43 in my checking account, and I sat on the edge of his bed and held his hand all night and prayed he would be okay, and he was okay. I straightened up. I smoothed the front of my dress with both hands. And then I walked to the restroom, used it, washed my hands, and looked at myself in the mirror one more time. "You are fine," I said quietly. To the woman in the mirror, she didn't look fine. She looked like she'd just had the stuffing knocked out of her. She looked like someone had just explained to her in patient, reasonable tones that she was the wrong kind of person for the occasion of her own son's wedding. But she smoothed her dress again, and she lifted her chin, and she walked back out into the reception with a small, steady smile on her face. Because she was Marlene Brooks, and she had walked through harder rooms than this one. Indeed. The gift-giving portion of the evening happened informally, with a table set up near the entrance where guests placed cards and packages as they came in. I had placed my card there when I arrived. The envelope a nice heavy cream paper, Caleb's name written on it in my best handwriting. After dinner, I watched Vanessa move through the room, speaking to guests, hugging friends, being effortlessly social in the way she always was. Caleb moved with her, tethered and happy. At one point, I caught his eye across the room. He smiled at me, a big, warm smile, the Caleb smile, the one I knew, and held up one finger as if to say, 1 minute, Mom, I'll come find you. He did not come find me. Not in 1 minute, not in 10. Not before the cake was cut, or after the first dance, or during the bouquet toss, or in any of the time that followed. I found him eventually standing near the bar with a group of friends. I touched his arm. He turned, and there was that smile again. Genuine, I want to say that. I want to be fair, but also slightly distracted. Like part of him was still in the conversation he'd just stepped away from. Mom, he hugged me. He smelled like his cologne and a little like champagne. I'm so glad you made it. I'm so glad I made it too, I said, and I meant it in more ways than one. I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to catch up properly. It's been so crazy today. I know, I said. That's how weddings go. You look great, he said, and his eyes moved down to the dress and back up, and he nodded. Did you make that? I did, I said. Of course you did. He said it warmly, but there was something quick about it, something that moved on fast. Listen, Vanessa's mom wants to get a family photo before the light goes completely. Can I? Of course, I said. Go. We'll find time later. He squeezed my arm and was gone. I stood next to the bar and watched him cross the room toward Vanessa, who took his hand without looking up from her conversation. The gesture automatic and intimate and exclusive. Two people in the center of a world that had been built very specifically around them. I was at the edge of that world. I could see that now, clearly, in a way I had been trying not to see for 2 years. The card was never opened that night, not that I could tell. When guests began leaving, the pile of gifts and envelopes were collected by someone and moved somewhere, and I left before I could find out more. I said goodbye to Caleb near the entrance. He hugged me again, longer this time, and said he'd call me when they were back from the honeymoon. Vanessa stood 2 feet away and said, "It was so wonderful to have you, Mrs. Brooks." Not Marlene, Mrs. Brooks. I said, "Congratulations, sweetheart," and I smiled, and I walked to my rental car in the dark parking lot, and I sat in it for 6 full minutes before I started the engine. I didn't cry. I don't know why. I thought I would, the way you think a storm is coming, because everything in the air has that particular weight and pressure, and then sometimes it just passes, goes somewhere else, leaves you sitting in the strange quiet after. I started the car. I drove back to my hotel, a modest chain hotel 20 minutes from the estate that I had booked, because it was in my budget and close enough to the venue. I ordered room service because the restaurant had already closed, a club sandwich and a cup of decaf, which came lukewarm and was not very good. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in my handmade dusty rose dress and ate my club sandwich and thought about what Vanessa had said. She's not really someone you put in the front row. I thought about the front row, the second row, the back table, the smile I had maintained for 7 hours, the letter in the card that Caleb probably hadn't read yet, the check that had required careful rearranging, the 11 weeks, the matching clutch. I thought about $43 and a sick 4-year-old, and a Tuesday night that had lasted forever. And then something happened inside me that I can only describe as a very quiet, very still, very final kind of reckoning. Not rage, not tears, not the dramatic collapse you might expect, just a question, sitting in the silence of that hotel room, soft and terrible. What exactly have I been building all this time, and for whom? I finished the sandwich. I put the tray outside the door. I washed my face and brushed my teeth and hung my dress carefully on the hanger in the closet so it wouldn't wrinkle. Then I got into bed, pulled the covers up, and lay in the dark, staring at a ceiling that looked nothing like the one on Dunmore Street. I had no answer to the question yet, but I had the question. And sometimes that's where everything real begins. The call came 11 days after the wedding. Not on day one, when I was still driving back to Dunmore Street with a rental car that smelled faintly of someone else's air freshener and a heart that felt like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. Not on day 3, when I had washed and pressed the dusty rose dress and hung it in the back of my closet and stood there for a moment with my hand on the fabric, not quite ready to close the door. Not on day 7, when I had started waking up again at my normal time and making my normal coffee and sitting in my normal chair by the window and trying to reconstruct something that felt like ordinary life. On day 11, my phone rang at 7:42 in the evening. Caleb's name on the screen. I looked at it for 2 full rings before I picked up. Mom. His voice was warm. He sounded good, relaxed, rested, the honeymoon still in his system. They'd gone to Cancun, 7 nights at an all-inclusive. He had texted me one photograph of the beach on day 3 with no caption, which I had taken as a sign that he was thinking of me, and which I had probably read too much into. "Hi, baby," I said, and I meant it. The warmth was real even then, even after everything. That's the thing nobody tells you about love in your children. The love doesn't cool down just because you're hurting. It just sits there alongside the hurt, the two of them coexisting in a way that makes no logical sense and yet is completely, devastatingly real. "We just got back this afternoon," he said. "Flight was delayed, so we're exhausted, but I wanted to check in. I'm glad you're home safe. How are you doing? I feel bad we didn't get more time at the reception. It was just so crazy," I said. "I know, that's how weddings go." I had said that exact sentence to him 2 weeks ago. He didn't notice. Right. A small pause. In the background, I could hear Vanessa's voice saying something I couldn't make out, and Caleb saying, "Yeah, in a minute." Then back to me. "The ceremony was beautiful, right? I think everything came together really well." "It was gorgeous," I said, "the venue especially. Vanessa worked so hard on it, like months of planning. She's incredible at that stuff." "She really is," I said. And I sat in my chair by the window and watched the streetlight come on outside and kept my voice exactly level and thought about 11 weeks of work and a matching clutch and a letter I had spent 3 weeks writing. Did you see the card I left?" I asked. I tried to make it casual. I did not entirely succeed. "The card? Yeah, we've got a whole pile of them to go through. We'll probably do that this weekend. It's a lot to sort through." He said it easily, the way you talk about a pleasant chore waiting for you. "Was there something in particular?" "No," I said. "Just wanted to make sure it didn't get lost in the shuffle." "It's all good, Mom, don't worry." I let it go. I had gotten very good at letting things go with a smile they couldn't see through the phone. We talked for another 12 minutes. He told me about Cancun, the food, the ocean, a snorkeling trip they'd taken on day 4. He was animated, genuinely happy, and I let his happiness wash over me the way I always had, like standing in warm water. This was my son. This was the person I had held all night through fevers and first heartbreaks and late-night panic about the future. Even across this distance, I didn't fully have a name for yet. I loved him without reservation. "I'll call you next week," he said. "We need to catch up properly." "Sounds good, baby. Love you, Mom." "Love you more," I said. The way I always said it. The way I had said it since he was old enough to understand the words. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a moment. Then I got up and went to the kitchen and washed the 3 dishes in the sink and dried them and put them away one at a time, very carefully, with the particular focus of someone who needs something ordinary to hold on to. He had not mentioned the dress, not once. I noticed that too. The weeks that followed had a specific texture to them, the texture of waiting for something that doesn't come. I would catch myself calculating the days since we'd last spoken. I would find reasons to text. A funny thing I'd read, a question about whether he'd tried a restaurant I'd heard about near his neighborhood, a photo of the garden out back where the roses were doing something spectacular this season. He would respond. Not right away usually, and not with much, but he would respond. A thumbs up, a ha-ha, occasionally a real sentence, once a voice memo while he was clearly driving somewhere. His voice, slightly distracted, saying he'd been meaning to call and would this weekend. That weekend came and went. I started counting the length of our calls, not obsessively, or maybe a little obsessively if I'm being honest with myself, which I am trying to be in this telling. Our calls, which used to run anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half when he first moved to Atlanta, were now averaging somewhere between 8 and 14 minutes. I would clock it sometimes after hanging up, just holding the phone and looking at the call duration on the screen. 11 minutes, 9 minutes, 13 minutes. Each one ending the same way. I'll call you soon, Mom. Love you. And then soon would be 12 days. I didn't say anything. That was my pattern. I could see it in retrospect, though I couldn't quite see it clearly while I was in it. I swallowed things. I smoothed things over. I told myself I was being reasonable, being understanding, giving him space to settle into his new life. Newlyweds needed space. That was normal. That was healthy. I was not going to be the overbearing mother-in-law from a bad sitcom. I was going to be understanding. I was extraordinarily understanding for approximately 6.5 weeks. And then my neighbor Dorothy came over on a Thursday afternoon to return the pair of garden shears she'd borrowed. And she sat down at my kitchen table and asked how the wedding had gone. And I opened my mouth to say wonderful. It was just beautiful, the way I had been saying it to everyone who asked. And instead, what came out was a very different sentence entirely. I think something's wrong, Dorothy. Dorothy was 73 and had lived on Dunmore Street even longer than I had, and had the particular gift of old friends, which is knowing when to ask a follow-up question and when to just be quiet. She put her hands flat on the table and was quiet. So I told her. Not everything, and I didn't tell her about the hallway, about the door that was slightly ajar, about the voice that had said, "She's not really someone you put in the front row." That part still felt too raw, too private, too much like something I hadn't fully integrated yet. But I told her about the second row, the seating arrangement at dinner, the gift that hadn't been mentioned, the 11-minute calls. Dorothy listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "What does your gut tell you, Marlene?" "That I'm being managed," I said. It was the first time I had put it into those exact words, and the precision of it surprised me. That I'm being kept at a comfortable distance, like something they take out when they need it and put back when they don't. Dorothy nodded slowly. "And what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet," I said. That was honest. I genuinely did not know yet. But the fact that I was using words like managed and comfortable distance and when they need it meant that some part of me had already crossed a line from hoping I was wrong to knowing I wasn't. That's a particular kind of grief, that crossing. Quiet and irreversible, like a door clicking shut in a house you've lived in for years. It was in October, about 8 weeks after the wedding, that I found out about the dinner party. I found out the way you find out most things you weren't meant to know, sideways, accidentally, through a gap in a conversation that someone forgot to close. Caleb called on a Tuesday evening, and he was in a good mood, talkative, and mentioned almost in passing that they'd had people over on Saturday. A dinner party, he said. 8 people. Vanessa had made her roasted chicken with the herb crust, which had apparently turned out perfectly, and they'd stayed up until midnight. "That sounds like a great time," I said. "Yeah, it was really nice. We're thinking of making it a monthly thing. A monthly dinner party. That's lovely. I love that idea." A beat, and then, because I'm 67 and I've been through enough to know that sometimes you have to ask the question you're afraid to ask, I said, "Was it mostly your work friends or..." "Mix of both," he said. "Some of Vanessa's co-workers, a couple from the neighborhood they've gotten to know, Marcus and Jenna. You remember Marcus, right?" I remembered Marcus. Marcus had been Caleb's best friend since they were 22. "Of course," I said. "It was a good group." He moved on, told me something about a project at work. I listened and responded, and the call ended at 14 minutes. After I hung up, I sat with a feeling I couldn't shake for the rest of the evening. It wasn't quite jealousy. It wasn't quite hurt. It was something more specific than both of those. The particular sting of realizing you have been categorized, that somewhere in the architecture of your child's adult life you have been placed in a folder labeled something like obligation or background or handle with care, while other people get placed in the folder that says chosen. I was his mother, I was background. I pulled out my sewing basket that night and started working on a repair job I'd been putting off, a customer's winter coat with a torn lining. I worked on it for 2 hours and focused on the stitches and tried not to think too hard. I wasn't entirely successful, but I kept sewing. Because that's what I did. That's what I had always done. When the feelings got too large, I put my hands to work and the work held me up. What I didn't know yet was how much worse it was about to get. The moment of clarity, the one that cracked everything open, came not from Caleb, but from Vanessa, directly for once. No hallway, no ajar door, no second-hand information. Just her voice on my phone on a Wednesday morning in early November, polished and deliberate. She called while I was in the middle of a fitting with a customer, so I let it go to voicemail and called back an hour later. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, "thank you for calling back. I wanted to reach out about something." A pause, the kind of pause that people take when they have rehearsed what comes next. I know we haven't had as much one-on-one time as either of us would probably like, and I just wanted to say that I think you're wonderful, and I know how much Caleb loves you. I recognized this opening. It was the kind of opening that professionals use before they say something you're not going to like. I had been on enough hard conversations in my life to know that any sentence beginning with, "I think you're wonderful," is building toward a but. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, and waited. I wanted to bring up something that I think has been on both our minds, Vanessa continued. We want to be thoughtful about how we build our life together, and part of that is being intentional about our social circles. The people we spend time with, the impression we make, the community we're building. Another pause. I know how much you care about Caleb, and I know your relationship with him is very important, but I also think it would be good for everyone if we were maybe a little more defined in how that relationship looks going forward. I sat very still. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "It just means, and I want to say this with love, that some of the ways you reach out can feel a little present. Like texting Caleb multiple times a week or calling when he hasn't responded to a message. I think it would be healthier for everyone if we were maybe a little more." "Vanessa," I said. She stopped. "I text my son 2 or 3 times a week," I said. "Is that what you mean by present?" "It's not just the frequency," she said, and her voice had shifted, still controlled, but with a new layer of something underneath it, something that wasn't quite patience. It's the dynamic it creates. Caleb feels pulled in different directions sometimes, and I think clearer boundaries would help him. Help everyone, really, feel more settled. Clearer boundaries. The phrase landed with a quiet finality. "What you're asking me to do," I said, and I was proud of how even my voice was. I was genuinely proud of it. "Is contact my son less. See him less. Make myself smaller. Is that right? I'm asking us to be intentional. Is that what you're asking, Vanessa?" A silence. "I think it would help the marriage," she said finally. And something in the way she said it, calm, absolute, like it was the last word on the subject, made my hand tighten around the phone. "I see," I said. "I really am saying this with care, Mrs. Brooks. I want us to have a good relationship." "I understand," I said. "I appreciate you calling." We said goodbye, professional, smooth. Exactly the kind of goodbye that two women who have understood each other completely and have nothing more to say perform when they want to maintain the appearance of civility. I set the phone down on my work table. I looked at it for a long time. There was thread everywhere around me, spools and scraps, the coat with the torn lining half finished in the frame. My hands were in my lap. I was aware of the ache in my left index finger, the arthritis that had been particularly bad this week. She's not really someone you put in the front row. Clearer boundaries, the impression we make, the community we're building. And underneath all of it, unspoken, but as clear as anything Vanessa had actually said, you are not part of the world we are building. You are an inconvenience that we are managing. You may love my husband, but love does not grant you access to our life. I thought about the check. I had found out eventually, casually in a passing comment from Caleb, 6 weeks after the wedding, that they were using it toward new furniture for the living room. He had said it easily, appreciatively, the way you mention a gift that was practical and well received. No mention of the letter, no mention of what was written in it. I had spent 3 weeks on that letter. I had written things in it that I had never said out loud to him. About the Tuesday night with the fever, about the feeling of driving home from his college orientation, knowing the house on Dunmore Street would be empty, about the specific pride of watching someone you built from nothing become someone remarkable. He had used it toward a sofa. I don't say that with bitterness. I want to be accurate about that. It's not that I begrudged him the sofa. It's that the letter had apparently been set aside, opened presumably, or maybe not even that, while the check was extracted and used, and the rest of it folded back into the envelope and filed or tossed or forgotten. That was the thing that finally broke something open in me. Not the seating chart, not the dinner party I wasn't invited to, not even Vanessa's managed, deliberate voice on the phone explaining that I needed to make myself smaller for the sake of their marriage. It was the letter that had taken 3 weeks and was now somewhere, maybe in a drawer, maybe in a recycling bin, while a sofa sat in their living room and no one thought any more about what it had cost. I called Dorothy that evening. She answered on the second ring, which was typical of Dorothy. "Can I come over?" I asked. "Front door's unlocked," she said. I sat at Dorothy's kitchen table for 2.5 hours. She made tea, and then later, when the tea wasn't enough, she opened a bottle of wine that had been sitting in her pantry since her birthday in March, and poured us each a glass that was probably too generous, and we sat with it, and I told her everything. This time, including the hallway, the door that was slightly ajar, the voice saying, "She's not really someone you put in the front row." Dorothy listened to all of it. She didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Did Caleb know she was going to call you?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe, probably." "Have you talked to him about it?" "Not yet." "Are you going to?" I looked at my wine glass, the particular deep red of it in the kitchen light. "I don't know that yet either," I said. Dorothy reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. She had big hands, Dorothy. She'd done a lot of yard work over the years, and her hands showed it. They were warm and solid, and exactly the right kind of hand to have covering yours in that particular moment. "You have given that boy everything you had," she said, not aggressively, just a statement of fact, the way you'd say the sky is blue or it's getting cold. You worked yourself past tired for 30 years so he could have a life. And I'm not saying he owes you for that. That's not how raising children works, and you know that better than anyone. She paused. But you do not owe anyone your self-erasure. You understand me? You don't owe her your smallness, and you don't owe him your silence just because asking for basic respect might make things complicated. I absorbed that. "I keep thinking," I said, that if I say something, if I push back, I'll lose him. I'll be the difficult one, the mother who couldn't let her son have his own life. And if you don't say anything, I knew the answer. I had known it for weeks in the quiet part of myself, where I kept the things I wasn't ready to deal with yet. "Then I disappear," I said, "just quietly, gradually, completely. I become a twice-a-year phone call and a card on his birthday, and someone he feels vaguely guilty about not visiting." "Yes," Dorothy said, "that's exactly right." We sat with that for a while. "So what do you do?" she asked. And that was the question, wasn't it? The question I'd been circling for weeks, the one that had no clean answer, the one that sat in the center of everything like a stone at the bottom of a clear pool. What do you do when the child you gave your life to has? Not through cruelty, maybe, not through anything as simple as hatred, simply filed you away? When the person you built everything for has decided or been persuaded that you are an inconvenience in the margins of his real life? What do you do when you realize that the door you thought was always open has been quietly and efficiently closed? I drove home from Dorothy's at 10:30. The street was quiet, the way Dunmore Street always was at that hour. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, looking at my house. 31 years in that house. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft in winter, every spot where the paint was peeling that I kept meaning to fix. I knew the house the way you know the body you live in, not perfectly, not without its problems, but intimately, thoroughly, like it was part of me. I had built a life in that house, a real one, alone mostly, but real. And somewhere in the past years, I had quietly started measuring that life by how it appeared to my son, whether it was good enough, presentable enough, impressive enough to earn my place at the table he was building. I had started making myself into something that would fit in his frame, not in my own. When had I done that? When had I started doing that? I went inside, I put on the kettle. I stood in my kitchen in the quiet of it, listening to the tick of the heating pipes and the small sounds of a house settling into the night. And then Caleb called. My phone lit up on the counter. Caleb calling. 10:47 p.m. Late for him to call without reason. "Hey, Mom." His voice was careful. I recognized careful. I had raised him to be careful with things that mattered. "Hi, baby." A pause. "Vanessa mentioned she talked to you today." "She did," I said. Another pause. Longer this time. How are you feeling about it?" And there it was, the question I had been wondering about since the call ended. Did he know? Had he sanctioned it? Had he sat across from his wife and said, "Someone needs to talk to her, the way you say someone needs to handle that about a problem"? "Caleb," I said slowly, "did you ask her to call me?" The pause that followed told me everything before he even spoke. "We talked about it together," he said. "It's not like she went rogue. It's something we both felt needed to be said." I closed my eyes for a moment, just a moment. "What is it exactly that needed to be said?" I asked. "Mom?" He exhaled. "It's not a criticism. It's just, we're newlyweds, right? We're trying to build our life together, and sometimes it feels like, I don't know, like there's a lot of pull in different directions. And Vanessa just wants to feel like our home, our space, is ours, you know? And my calling twice a week threatens that." I didn't say, "Caleb." My voice was quiet. I want to be clear about that. I was not yelling. I have never been a yeller. It was never in me. But there was something in my voice in that moment that must have cut through, because he went very still on the other end of the line. "I need you to tell me something honestly. Do you feel the same way? Not Vanessa, you. Do you feel like I need to step back?" The silence stretched long enough that it had texture. "I think," he said finally, "that it would be good for everyone if we were a little more intentional about—" "That's her language," I said. "That's what she said to me, almost word for word. I'm asking what you think in your own words." Another silence. Shorter this time. "I think the boundaries thing is reasonable, Mom. I think you could maybe give us a little more space." I let those words sit between us. 34 years old. The baby I had carried alone into a hospital at 2 in the morning. The 4-year-old who had held my hand during a fever that terrified me. The teenager who had brought me tea without being asked. The young man I had funded and encouraged and quietly, consistently put first for decades of my life. "I think the boundaries thing is reasonable." "Okay," I said. "Okay? Okay." I kept my voice even because what I was feeling in that moment was too large and too complex and too important to be handed over in that phone call. In the kitchen of my house at 10:47 at night, when I was tired and the kettle was starting to whistle. "I hear you, Caleb. I'll give you space." He exhaled. Relief, I thought, though I wasn't entirely sure that didn't make it worse. "Thank you, Mom. I knew you'd understand. You always—" "Good night, baby," I said. "I love you." "Love you too, Mom. Good night." I hung up. I poured the hot water over my tea bag. I watched the color bloom outward in the water, dark and spreading, the way everything was spreading in me right now. the realization, the hurt, the grief, and underneath all of it, something new. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Not the hot, volcanic kind that burns out quickly. The other kind. The slow, deep, tectonic kind that builds over years of accommodation and swallowing and smiling and being reasonable. And then one night, finally, quietly shifts. I stood at my kitchen counter at 10:50 in the evening and drank my tea and let the anger be there. Didn't rush it, didn't push it down, just let it exist the way you let a fire exist when you finally acknowledge that the house is already burning, and pretending otherwise was the problem all along. I thought about what Dorothy had said. You don't owe her your smallness. No, I did not. I thought about the dress, the letter, the 11 minutes, the dinner party I wasn't invited to, the word boundaries used as a weapon by a woman who had 8 weeks ago called me someone you don't put in the front row. I thought about 67 years of a life, a real, complicated, earned life. A life that had produced something beautiful, even if that beautiful thing had, somewhere along the way, stopped looking back. I set my teacup down, and for the first time in 67 years, I made myself a promise. Not to anyone else, not as a performance of strength, not as a declaration I would announce, just a quiet, private, iron-solid promise made in a kitchen on Dunmore Street at nearly 11 o'clock at night. I was done making myself smaller for people who had never once considered making themselves larger for me. I was done. What that meant exactly, what it would look like, I didn't know yet. I had the promise before I had the plan, but some things have to be decided before they can be figured out. The anger was still there, low and steady, like a pilot light that had been waiting to be turned on. I left my teacup on the counter and went to bed. For the first time in months, I slept without waking up at 3 a.m. with something heavy sitting on my chest. That was the first sign that something had genuinely changed. Not the last, as it turned out, but the first. I kept my promise, not dramatically, not with a speech or a slammed door or any of the things you see in movies when someone reaches their breaking point and decides they've had enough. That's not how I did it. That's never been how I did anything. I was 67 years old, and I had learned through the long grinding curriculum of a hard life that the most powerful decisions are the ones nobody sees coming, not because you're being strategic, but because the decision is so internal, so deeply rooted in your own marrow that it doesn't require an audience. I simply stopped. The morning after that phone call with Caleb, I woke up and did not reach for my phone to send him a good morning text. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. I had been sending some variation of a morning text to my son for 4 years, since he moved to Atlanta, and I realized that a simple good morning, thinking of you cost me nothing, and might remind him in the chaos of his day that someone out there was always, always in his corner. I had done it without thinking. The way you drink water or breathe, a reflex of love. I stopped the reflex. I put my phone face down on the nightstand and lay on my back and stared at the ceiling. My ceiling, the one I had stared at through 31 years of everything. And I made a conscious, deliberate decision to wait. Not forever, not as punishment, just to wait and see and find out what happened when I stopped being the one who always reached first. The first week was the hardest. On day 3, I picked up my phone twice with the genuine intention of calling him. The first time, I set it back down. The second time, I stood in my kitchen with it in my hand for probably 4 minutes before I set it back down again. I felt guilty in a way that was almost physical, a tightness in my chest, a low-grade buzz of anxiety that I'd spent decades training myself to respond to by picking up the phone or driving down or sending the text or writing the check. The anxiety said something might be wrong. He might need you. You're being stubborn. This is childish. The anxiety was very articulate. It had a lot of arguments. But underneath the anxiety, quieter and steadier, was the other thing. The thing from the kitchen at 10:50 at night. You don't owe her your smallness, and its companion, which I had added in the days since. You don't owe him your erasure just because asking for something real might create discomfort. I set the phone down. By the end of week 2, something unexpected happened. The guilt didn't disappear. I want to be accurate about that. It didn't disappear. It never fully does when it's been your operating system for 30 years. But it began to quiet. And in the space where the guilt had been loudest, other things started to appear. Small things. Ordinary things that I had been too distracted to notice for longer than I cared to admit. The garden, for instance. For I had a small garden in the back of the house on Dunmore Street. Mostly roses and a stretch of lavender along the fence, with a patch near the gate that I'd intended to replant for years and never gotten around to. That first week of stepping back from Caleb, I spent a Saturday afternoon in the garden and worked until my back ached and my knees complained, and my hands, even the arthritic left one, were dark with soil. I pulled weeds and pruned the late season roses and dug up the neglected patch and turned the soil and decided I was going to plant something there in the spring, something for me, not because it was practical or because it would impress anyone, just because I wanted to see it grow. I came inside when the light was going, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and realized I had spent 4 hours not thinking about Caleb, about Vanessa, about the phone, about any of it. 4 hours entirely inside my own afternoon. The feeling was so unfamiliar it almost scared me. That was the beginning, the first small thread of something I had stopped thinking of as available to me, the ordinary, sufficient pleasure of my own life. Caleb called on day 16. Not because something was wrong. His voice was normal, easy, the casual warmth he'd always had on the phone when things were fine. "Hey Mom, haven't heard from you in a bit. Everything okay?" I noticed that. "Haven't heard from you." He noticed the silence. It had taken 16 days, but he noticed. "Everything's fine, baby," I said. "I've been keeping busy." "Yeah? What have you been up to?" "Garden work, some client pieces. I've been thinking about taking a class in the spring." That last part had just occurred to me that week. Vaguely, loosely, not yet a plan. But I said it out loud and it became a little more real. A class in what? I'm not sure yet. I've been looking at a few things. A brief pause. I think he was recalibrating slightly, expecting the usual update about how I was getting along and missing him and how the house was quiet. The script we had both been performing without realizing it. The script where I played the devoted, slightly lonely mother and he played the loving but busy son, and we both understood our roles. I had just broken slightly from the script and he noticed, even if he couldn't have said exactly what was different. "Well, that's great, Mom," he said, and he meant it, I think. But there was a small uncertain note underneath it, like a musician hearing an unexpected key change. "How are you two doing?" I asked. "Really good. Vanessa got a promotion, senior director now. She's been working crazy hours, but she's happy." "That's wonderful," I said. "Tell her congratulations." We talked for 18 minutes. It was the longest call we'd had in 2 months. I didn't analyze that until after I hung up, and then I sat with it a moment. 18 minutes when I wasn't performing need or gratitude or availability, just being a full, occupied person who had her own afternoon and her own plans, and thought, interesting. What I did not know yet was what was coming, what was assembling itself quietly in Atlanta while I was gardening and thinking about spring classes and rediscovering the dimensions of my own life. The first indication came from Marcus. Marcus called me on a Thursday in early December. Not unusual. He had always been good about keeping in touch, one of those people who understood that the parents of your best friends are people too. We talked occasionally, maybe every few months. He asked how I was doing. I said honestly, all things considered, I was doing all right. He said that was good, and then there was a quality to his pause that I recognized. "Is there something on your mind, Marcus?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I don't want to get in the middle of anything, Mrs. B. You can tell me," I said. "I'm 67. I can handle it." Another pause. There's been some talk, he said carefully, about the estate planning stuff, about the house. I went very still. What kind of talk? Just, I heard something at dinner a few weeks back from Caleb about whether you thought about updating your will since the wedding. About the house specifically. What was going to happen with it? He paused. I probably shouldn't have said anything. It might have just been conversation. I don't know the context. What did he say exactly? Can you tell me? Marcus exhaled. He said Vanessa had raised the idea of whether you'd maybe be interested in downsizing sometime soon. Said the house is big for one person. And then there was some talk about, I don't know, about how if you ever were to sell, the equity could be useful for the investment property plans. I was quiet for long enough that Marcus said, Mrs. B, you still there? I'm here, I said. Thank you for telling me. I'm sorry, he said. I thought you should know. You were right to tell me, I mean that. After I got off the phone with Marcus, I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Dorothy had covered my hand with hers 2 months ago, the same table where Caleb had done his homework for years while I worked the machine in the next room. And I stayed very, very still. The house on Dunmore Street, 31 years. My mother's sewing box on the shelf, the garden out back, the window where the morning light came through at the angle I had memorized without meaning to. The bedroom ceiling I had stared at through every hard night of the last 3 decades. They were talking about my house. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because dishonesty would be easy. It would be easy to say I felt rage or betrayal or cold certainty, something clean and simple. What I actually felt was more complicated than any of those things. There was rage, yes, there was a specific ice-water clarity of betrayal. But there was also, and this is the part that's hard to admit, a kind of grief so acute it almost felt physical, because this was my son, this was Caleb, the 4-year-old, the teenager with the T, the young man I had funded and believed in and never, not once, not for a single day, stopped loving. And somewhere in the world he was building, in the architecture of the life he and Vanessa were designing together, his mother's house had become a line item, an equity opportunity, a resource to be considered. I sat at the table for a long time. Then I did 2 things. First, I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Ossie, who had handled a small property dispute for me 4 years earlier, and who had the particular quality I valued most in professionals. She was direct without being cold. I left her a message saying I needed an appointment to review and update my will and any related estate documents. I said it wasn't an emergency, but that I wanted it done before the end of the year. The second thing I did was call Dorothy. Dorothy answered on the first ring this time. I told her what Marcus had said. I was concise about it. No dramatics, no tears, just the facts laid flat and clear on the table between us. When I finished, Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I have not forgotten. Marlene, when someone shows you who they are and then shows you again and then shows you a third time, at what point do you stop calling it a misunderstanding? I didn't answer because the answer was obvious and I'd run out of ways to avoid it. It's not just Vanessa anymore, Dorothy said. That's what you're realizing, isn't it? Yes, I said. That's what I'm realizing, because that was the thing that had shifted. For months, I had been drawing a careful protective line in my mind between Vanessa, the architect of all this, the woman behind the curtain, the one managing the image and the social circles, and the deliberate smallness of my role, and Caleb, my son, who I had told myself was just in a difficult position, caught between his wife and his mother, doing his best. I had given him the benefit of every doubt I possessed. But the house conversation hadn't been Vanessa's idea presented to an unwilling Caleb. It had been Caleb talking to Marcus at a dinner party, Caleb's voice, Caleb's words, whether you'd be interested in downsizing. The equity could be useful. He knew what my house meant to me. He had grown up in it. He had sat at this table and done his homework while I worked. He knew. And he had talked about it like it was a portfolio asset. 2 days later, Caleb called. Normal voice, normal check-in. He didn't mention Marcus, which meant Marcus hadn't told him. I listened to him talk about work and about some holiday party they were planning, and about how Vanessa wanted to get a dog, but they were still debating the timing, and I contributed normally to the conversation, asking questions, laughing where it was appropriate, saying the right things. And then, near the end of the call, he said it. Hey Mom, this is kind of random, but Vanessa and I have been talking about our financial goals for next year, and we were thinking, and this is just a conversation, nothing serious, but have you ever thought about whether Dunmore Street is really the right fit for you long term? Like, it's a lot of house for one person, and the market's actually really good right now. Caleb, I said. He stopped. That house is not part of any conversation, I said. And my voice was so quiet and so absolutely final that he didn't say anything for a full 5 seconds. Mom, I wasn't saying, I know what you were saying, I said, and I need you to hear me clearly. The house on Dunmore Street is mine. It has been mine for 31 years. It is not a financial planning discussion. It is not an investment opportunity. It is my home. And the fact that this conversation is happening tells me more than I wanted to know about some things. I paused. Do you understand me? A silence, different from the usual kind, uncomfortable, real. Yeah, he said finally. His voice had lost its ease. Yeah, Mom, I hear you. Good, I said. I love you. I'll talk to you soon. I hung up before he could redirect, reframe, smooth it over. I had become very good at hanging up before the smoothing over happened, because the smoothing over was how I had ended up here. I called Patricia Osai the next morning and made the appointment. We met the following Tuesday at her office. I sat across from her and I was clear and methodical about what I wanted. The will updated, the house explicitly protected, the beneficiary designations reviewed on all accounts. She was thorough and she did not ask unnecessary questions, which I appreciated. At the end of our meeting, she handed me a folder of documents to review and said they'd have everything drafted within 2 weeks. I walked out of her office into a December afternoon. Cold, the sky doing that flat grey thing it does before snow. And I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Real breath, deep and clear. The kind of breath you take when you have just done something that needed doing for a long time. I was protecting myself. Maybe for the first time in my adult life, in any real and formal and documented way, I was protecting myself. The holidays were strange that year. They had invited me for Christmas. Caleb had called in late November, before the house conversation, to say they were staying in Atlanta this year, but would love it if I came down. After the house conversation, the invitation was not revisited. I think he expected me to bring it back up. I did not. I told Dorothy I was going to spend Christmas at home, and Dorothy, who spent Christmas with her daughter's family 2 hours away, said she would come back on the 27th, and we would do our own version of things, and that was that. Christmas morning, I made a full breakfast, eggs, toast, the good orange juice, and ate it slowly at the kitchen table and put on music I liked, old Motown that I had loved since I was 20, and which I almost never played because I usually had something else running. Some background noise, some half attention paid to whatever screen was nearest. I ate my breakfast and listened to Marvin Gaye and looked out the window at the December garden, dormant and bare, but with the bones of something I was planning for spring. I got one text from Caleb at 11:15. Merry Christmas, Mom, love you, with an emoji of a Christmas tree. I texted back, Merry Christmas, sweetheart, and that was the sum of our holiday exchange. A year ago, that would have broken my heart. Sitting alone in my kitchen on Christmas morning, while my son sent me a text with an emoji, what I actually felt, sitting there with my eggs and my Motown, was something stranger and quieter than heartbreak, something almost like peace. The specific peace of a person who is no longer contorting herself to fit a space that was never going to accommodate her, who has stopped pressing herself small against a door that was never going to open, who has stepped back from the door and discovered, slowly, with more surprise than she expected, that the room she was already standing in had always been enough. It was not a perfect piece. I want to be clear about that. It had grief in it. It had loneliness in it. It had the particular ache of a mother who loves her child with her whole self and cannot access that child through the wall that has been quietly, efficiently built around him. Those things were real, and I was not pretending they weren't, but I was not performing anymore, and that, even on Christmas morning alone in my kitchen, was worth something. In January, I signed up for the class I had mentioned to Caleb on the phone that day, the one I'd said vaguely, not quite yet a plan. I had gone home and looked it up properly, and it turned out to be exactly the right thing. A textile art and design course at the Community Arts Center 12 minutes from my house. 3 hours every Tuesday evening, a mix of sewing technique and design theory, and a little history of fabric as an artistic medium, taught by a woman named Renata, who had spent 20 years as a costume designer in regional theatre and had the energy of someone who had never once done anything halfway. The first night I walked in not knowing anyone, which was a feeling I had not had in years. The room had 14 students ranging in age from probably 22 to a woman named Betty, who was in her late 70s and had decided, she announced cheerfully to the group, that she had been putting off creative projects for too long and was not putting them off anymore. I liked Bet immediately. Renata went around the room and asked everyone to say their name and what they made. When she got to me, I said, "Marlene, I've been a seamstress and custom garment maker for about 30 years. Renata looked at me with an expression of genuine delight. 30 years. Well then, Marlene, you're not here to learn how to sew. Why are you here?" It was the kind of question that's phrased simply, but lands much bigger. I thought about it for a real moment. The room was quiet, waiting. "I think," I said, "I'm here to remember that what I do is art, not just work. Art." Renata smiled. "Perfect," she said. "That's the best reason." After class, Bet found me by the coat rack and said, "That was a good answer." I wasn't sure it made sense until I said it, I admitted. "The best answers are like that," Betta said, pulling on a wool coat that was a genuinely beautiful color, a deep teal, almost green. "I'm getting coffee next door. Do you want to come?" I considered this. I had nowhere to be. I had no text to send and no call to make and nothing waiting for me except the house on Dunmore Street, quiet and mine. "Yes," I said, "I'd like that." We sat at the coffee shop for an hour and a half. Bet had been a high school English teacher for 35 years, had lost her husband 4 years ago, had 3 grown children scattered across 4 states, and had decided at 78 that the remaining chapter of her life was going to be hers in a way none of the previous chapters quite had been. She said this without self-pity and without drama, the way you state a fact that has taken a long time to accept, but that you are now fully comfortable with. I told her about my work, about custom gowns, about the particular satisfaction of turning raw fabric into something that would be worn on a day someone would remember forever. She listened with genuine interest, asking specific questions, the kind that told me she was actually hearing me and not just being polite. I did not tell her about Caleb. Not that night. That would come later, gradually, the way trust accumulates between people who are in each other's orbit regularly enough to matter. But I drove home at 9:30 feeling something I had almost forgotten the name for. Seen, not by my son. Not validated by being useful or needed or summoned. Just seen by a stranger over coffee because I had been fully myself for 90 minutes and that had been sufficient. More than sufficient. It was in February that the next thing happened. The thing that clarified once and for all what this new dynamic truly was. Not a misunderstanding, not growing pains, not the complicated normal of a son caught between a mother and a wife. Vanessa called me on a Tuesday afternoon. My Tuesday, which now belonged to my class. But the class was in the evening, so the afternoon was mine, and I was in the middle of a design exercise Renata had assigned, playing with a piece of silk charmeuse in a color I didn't entirely know what to do with yet. I answered because I was curious. We had not spoken directly since November. Her voice, when she came on, was warm in that professional way, the voice of someone who wants something. Marlene, she said. She used my first name. She had never used my first name before. I noted that and did not comment on it. I know things have been a little quiet between us, and I just wanted to reach out and say that I hope there are no hard feelings about the conversations we had last fall. No hard feelings, I said. Good, I'm glad. A small pause, gathering. I'm actually reaching out because we have some exciting things happening. We found an investment property we love, Zamaz. It's in a great neighborhood, good bones, rental potential is really strong, and we're moving pretty quickly on it. The window is tight, and we need to act by the end of the month. I held the silk charmeuse in my hand and didn't say anything. We were hoping, Vanessa continued, her voice smooth and unhurried, that you might be in a position to help with the down payment. As a loan, obviously with documentation, whatever makes you comfortable. We'd pay you back with interest. A pause. Caleb didn't want to ask, you know how he is, but I thought, family helps family, right? The silence I let fall after that sentence was long enough to be deliberate. Family helps family. Said by the woman who had explained to her bridesmaid that I was not really someone you put in the front row. Said by the woman who had called me to establish clearer boundaries and reduce my access to my own son. Said by the woman who had sat with her husband and discussed whether my house might be worth liquidating for their investment goals. Family helps family. How much? I said. She named a number. It was significant. It was the kind of number that would have required me, even 2 years ago when I was still in the habit of rearranging accounts for my son's benefit, to do some serious damage to the financial cushion I had been carefully building for my retirement. I see, I said. We would pay you back, she said again. This isn't a gift, it's a loan. Vanessa, I said, I'm going to say something and I want you to hear me. Her voice shifted slightly. Of course. I spent the better part of 2 years trying to earn my place in your life, in your home, in my son's new world. I showed up to that wedding in a dress I made with these hands. I wrote Caleb a letter that took me 3 weeks. I absorbed every quiet signal that I wasn't quite the right kind of person for the life you were building. I accepted the phone calls about boundaries and intentionality, and I took that gracefully. Because I love my son and I believed for a very long time that the best thing I could do was make myself smaller and hope that smaller would be small enough. Silence on the other end. But now, I said, when there's a number that needs to be filled, when there's a financial gap that's inconvenient, now it's family helps family. Now it's a loan with interest, very official, very comfortable. I paused. You understand why I'm having trouble with that. Marlene, I'm not going to help with the down payment, I said, not because I don't love Caleb. I love him more than I will ever be able to say, but because I have spent 67 years putting other people at the center of the life I should have been living, and I am done. I am completely and permanently done. Another silence, longer this time. When Vanessa spoke, the professional warmth had gone. What was underneath it was colder. I think that's a decision you'll regret. Maybe, I said, but it'll be my decision, and that's new. I ended the call. My hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, from the particular physical cost of doing the thing you have needed to do for a long time, but have been too afraid to do, which is different from fear itself. It's the shake of finally. It's the shake of a door you've been pressing against with your whole body, finally giving way. I set the phone down on my work table. The silk charmeuse was still in my other hand, cool and light, catching the afternoon light from the window. I looked at it for a moment, that particular color, somewhere between amber and copper, catching the light differently depending on the angle, that I hadn't known what to do with when I picked it up this morning. I knew now I could see it clearly. I stretched it out on the table and reached for my pins. My hands were still shaking, but they were steady enough to work. They were always steady enough to work. That had always been true of my hands, and it still was, and it would go on being true. That was something nobody had given me and nobody could take. The afternoon light came through the window at the angle I had memorized without meaning to. I began to work. Caleb called 3 days after Vanessa's call. I knew it was coming, not because I had any particular insight into their dynamic, not because I was running calculations, but because I knew my son. I had known him for 34 years, through every version of himself he'd cycled through, and I knew that when something went wrong in his world, he processed it for approximately 72 hours before he picked up the phone. He had done it at 16 when he crashed my car backing out of the driveway. He had done it at 22 when he failed 2 exams in the same week and didn't tell me for 3 days. He had done it his whole life, that particular rhythm of sitting with a problem privately before bringing it outward. 3 days, almost exactly. I was in the middle of a fitting when he called. A client named June, who was having her mother's vintage blazer reconstructed into something she could actually wear to her office, a project I found genuinely interesting. I let the call go to voicemail, finished the fitting properly, saw June to the door, and then sat down with my coffee and listened to the message. His voice on the voicemail was careful in the way it got when he had prepared what he wanted to say. "Hey Mom, I think we need to talk about the conversation you had with Vanessa. Can you call me when you have a chance? I love you." I sat with the message for a while. I drank my coffee. I looked out the window at the February garden, still dormant, still waiting, the beds I had turned over in autumn, sitting patient and dark under the pale winter sky. I had ordered bulbs, tulips and alliums, and a variety of ranunculus in a deep coral that I had never grown before. They were in a paper bag in the hall closet waiting for March. I called him back at 4 o'clock. "Mom," he answered on the first ring, which told me he had been holding the phone. "Thanks for calling back." "Of course," I said. "So," he exhaled. "Vanessa told me about the conversation. I figured she would. She's upset." A pause. "She felt like you were pretty harsh with her." I took a moment with that, the word harsh. I filed it alongside present and intentional and boundaries in the collection of words I'd been given over the past several months as substitutes for what was actually happening. "What did she tell you?" I said. I asked. He recounted it reasonably accurately. The part about spending 2 years trying to earn my place, the part about making myself smaller, the part about being done. He left out the part where she told me I'd regret it, which I noticed. "That's accurate," I said. "Is there something in there that isn't true?" "Mom, she wasn't trying to be manipulative. She genuinely thought you might want to help. She thought it would be a way to—" "Caleb," I said his name quietly. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Not the diplomatic answer, not the answer that keeps everyone comfortable. The honest one." A pause. "Okay. Did you know she was going to call me and ask for that money?" The silence told me again before he spoke. "We discussed it," he said. "Yeah." "So you knew, and you chose to have her make the call instead of calling me yourself." I thought she might be able to frame it better. I knew you might say no, and I didn't want it to become a whole thing between us. "But it is a whole thing," I said. "It's been a whole thing for 7 months. You just haven't been looking directly at it." He was quiet. "I need you to understand something," I said, and I kept my voice level because what I was about to say was too important to deliver at any kind of pitch. "I would walk through fire for you. That has not changed. It will never change, but I will not be managed. I will not be handled and kept at a comfortable distance and then called upon when there's something you need from me. That is not a relationship. That is a utility arrangement, and I deserve better than that. You know I deserve better than that." The silence that followed was the longest one yet, long enough that I actually checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. It hadn't. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter. The prepared speech quality was gone. "I hear you, Mom." "Do you?" "I do." Another pause. I think I've been trying really hard not to be in the middle of things between you and Vanessa. And the way I was doing that was I was taking the path of least resistance, and that wasn't fair to you. I absorbed that. It was more than I had expected. Not everything, not a full accounting, not a reckoning, nothing as clean as a sincere and complete apology. But it was real. I could hear that it was real, the way you can hear the difference between someone saying a true thing and someone saying the thing they think you need to hear. Thank you for saying that, I said. I don't want this distance between us. Then you're going to have to make some different choices, I said. I can't make them for you. I'm done trying to manage my way into your life. If there's a relationship to be had between us, you're going to have to show up for it the same way I always have. Another pause. That's fair, he said. I know it is, I said. I love you, Caleb. I'll talk to you soon. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap, and I noticed something. My hands weren't shaking, not even slightly. The steadiness that had been slowly returning to me over these months was fully present in that moment, and I recognized it. It was the steadiness of a woman who knew where she stood. That was March, and March was when everything else began. Not everything resolved. I want to be careful about making this sound cleaner than it was. The relationship with Caleb did not transform overnight from that one phone call. He and I moved carefully with each other for weeks afterward, like two people who have bumped into a piece of furniture in the dark and are now walking more slowly through the same room. He called more regularly. The calls were shorter sometimes and longer others. He did not mention the investment property again, and neither did I. He did not mention Vanessa's reaction to my refusal, and neither did I. We were finding, slowly and imperfectly, some different version of how to talk to each other. It was awkward in places. It was real. But March was also when I went to Savannah. It had been Betta's idea originally. In class one Tuesday, she had mentioned offhandedly that she was taking herself to Savannah for a long weekend in March. She had a friend there she visited occasionally, and she was going to spend 2 extra days on her own, just walking and looking at things and eating good food, and not being anyone's anything for 72 hours. She said it the way she said most things, with a cheerful matter-of-factness that managed to make the idea sound both completely ordinary and quietly radical. After class, over our usual coffee, I told her I had never taken a trip alone. She looked at me with an expression that was not quite disbelief, but was close to it. Never, she said. I mean, for work occasionally, but not a trip for myself, for the sake of it. Betta wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at me steadily. Marlene, she said, you are 67 years old. I know. You have been taking care of something or someone for your entire adult life. I know that too. Then go somewhere. She said it the way you tell someone to drink water when they say they have a headache. Simply, obviously. Go somewhere beautiful and walk around and eat a good dinner alone, and don't apologize to anyone for taking up space. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I booked a room at a small inn in Savannah's historic district for 4 nights in mid-March. Not the cheapest option, not extravagant, but a room with a private bathroom and a window that faced the courtyard, and a bed that, when I arrived and sat on the edge of it after driving 4.5 hours alone for the first time in years, was exactly as comfortable as it looked in the photographs. I sat on that bed in that room in Savannah, and I did something I had not done in longer than I could accurately calculate. I did absolutely nothing for 20 minutes. I did not check my phone. I did not make a list. I did not think about the clients waiting, or the class assignment due, or what Caleb might be doing, or whether I had remembered to water the plant on the kitchen windowsill. I sat on the bed in the late afternoon light, and I breathed, and I looked at the window, and I let the quiet be quiet. Then I washed my face and went out to find dinner. I ate alone at a small restaurant on a cobblestone street. A bowl of she-crab soup that was the best thing I had put in my mouth in recent memory, followed by flounder with a lemon caper situation that I thought about for days afterward. I had a glass of white wine. I watched the other diners, a young couple who kept looking at each other like they were still slightly amazed to be in the same room. A table of women in their 50s, clearly a friend group of some long-standing, laughing loud enough that the whole restaurant felt the benefit of it. An older man eating alone near the window, reading a paperback, comfortable in his solitude in a way that I recognized and aspired to. I sat there for an hour and 40 minutes. When the check came, I paid it without doing the mental calculation I always did. The one where I converted the amount into how many hours of work it represented. The mental accounting of a woman who had always spent carefully because spending carelessly had always felt like a risk she couldn't afford. I paid it and tipped generously and walked back out into the Savannah evening, which was still warm enough to be pleasant and smelled like something flowering that I couldn't identify. The 4 days in Savannah did something to me that I can only imperfectly describe. It wasn't transformation. That word implies something faster and more complete than what actually happened. It was more like recalibration, like a compass that had been slightly off for years, reading just a few degrees wrong in a way that accumulated over distance until you found yourself somewhere you hadn't intended to be. And then someone gave the compass a small, precise correction, and now it was pointing accurately again. I walked through the squares of the historic district, and I visited a textile museum, where I spent 2 hours looking at quilts from the 19th century, made by women whose names were sometimes recorded and sometimes not. And I stood in front of one of them, a double wedding ring pattern in indigo and white, probably 1880s, the stitching so fine and even it seemed impossible, and I felt something in my chest that was half grief and half recognition. Women who made beautiful things, women whose hands had done extraordinary work, women whose names might not be on the wall, but whose hands were in every stitch. I thought about my mother's sewing box on the shelf in the living room on Dunmore Street. I thought about 30 years of custom gowns and the brides who had worn them. I thought about an 11-week dress in dusty rose that a woman in a bridal suite had dismissed without having any idea what it cost. I stood in front of that quilt for a long time. Then I took out my phone and photographed it, not for anyone else, just for myself. And I kept walking. On the 3rd day, I found a bead and textile shop in an alley off one of the main squares, run by a woman approximately my age named Sylvie, who had the kind of organized chaos in her shop that told you she knew where everything was, even if nobody else could tell. We started talking over a display of Japanese silk threads and talked for over an hour. She had been making and selling textile art for 25 years. She showed me the back room where she kept her own work-in-progress pieces. Large format wall hangings, fiber art in the truest sense, structural and abstract and genuinely moving. "Have you ever done anything like this?" she asked, gesturing at the wall hangings. "No," I said. "I've done functional garments alterations." "But you want to," she said. It wasn't a question. I looked at the wall hangings, the scale of them, the way the fiber held light and shadow differently from fabric. The way the structure of each piece was visible, not hidden inside a seam, not smoothed away, but right there, integral, part of the beauty. "I think I might," I said. I bought several things from Sylvie's shop that day. Threads and some specialty fiber I'd never worked with, and a book on textile art technique that she recommended. When I got back to the inn, I sat with the book for 3 hours and didn't look up. Driving home on the 4th day, I made a list in my head. Not a to-do list, more like a declaration of intent. Things I was going to do. A spring exhibition at the art center that Renata had mentioned, where students could submit work. I was going to finish the piece I'd started with the silk charmeuse and submit it. I was going to plant the bulbs the week I got home. Finally. I was going to start the large format fiber work I had been sketching in my head since Sylvie's back room. I was going to look into whether there was a textile arts guild or collective anywhere in my area. I was going to take myself somewhere else before the year was out. New Orleans maybe, or the coast of Maine. Somewhere I had never been, for no reason except that I wanted to see it. These sound like small things. They were not small things. They were a 67-year-old woman reclaiming the territory of her own life. Not dramatically, not with anyone watching, but claim by quiet claim. I got home on a Sunday evening. I watered the plant on the kitchen windowsill, which had been fine without me. I made tea. I sat in my chair by the window, and I was tired from the drive in a good, ordinary way. My left finger ached in the familiar way it always did. Outside, the street was quiet. My phone had 3 texts, one from Dorothy asking how the trip was, one from Bet with a photograph of a sunset she'd seen from somewhere and a caption that just said, "See?" and one from Caleb sent Saturday afternoon, "Hope Savannah is good, Mom. Text when you're home safe." I had mentioned the trip to him 2 weeks prior, in passing, during one of our calls. He had said, "Oh, that's great, Mom," in a tone that held a note of surprise he hadn't quite been able to mask, as if the idea of his mother going somewhere for her own pleasure was a new category of information he was incorporating. I had said yes, I thought it would be nice, and moved on. The text made me stop for a moment. "Hope Savannah is good." Simple, unprompted. He had thought of me on a Saturday without needing anything. I texted back, "Just got home. It was wonderful. Talk soon." Then I put the phone down and finished my tea. I planted the bulbs the following weekend. All of them. The tulips and alliums and the deep coral ranunculus. Everything I'd ordered and kept in the paper bag in the hall closet all winter. I spent a full Saturday afternoon on my knees in the garden bed, pressing each bulb into the turned soil at the right depth, spacing them properly, covering them over. My knees ached by the end of it. My back ached. My left hand, damp from the soil, throbbed in the familiar way. I came inside dirty and tired and ran a bath and lay in it until the water went tepid and the ache in my joints settled down to the usual background level. Then I made soup, a good one from scratch because I had the time and I felt like it. And I ate it at the kitchen table and looked at the dark garden through the window and thought about what was sleeping under the soil out there, waiting for warmth. The Art Center exhibition deadline was late April. I had 8 weeks, and the piece I was working with, the silk charmeuse in amber copper, which had grown considerably from the original design exercise, was more ambitious than anything I had made in years. Not a garment, not functional, a textile piece that was both structured and fluid, that incorporated the hand stitching I'd been developing with Renata and the fiber techniques I'd started exploring since Savannah. It lived on a frame in my living room, and I worked on it in the mornings before clients and in the evenings after, and it was the first project in as long as I could remember that I made with no audience in mind, not for a bride, not for a client, not even for Caleb. For the precise pleasure of making something as close to my exact vision as my hands could manage. The arthritis made some days harder than others. I would sometimes have to set the work down and flex my fingers and apply heat and weight. I had learned to work around it rather than fight it. Shorter sessions, different angles, taking the breaks my hands demanded, instead of pushing through until I made errors. The process was slower than it would have been 10 years ago. The work was better. Renata, when she saw it progressing over the weeks, said nothing at first. Just walked around the frame and looked at it from every angle with the focused silence of someone who takes work seriously. Then she said, "Submit it. Don't second guess. Submit it." "It's not finished," I said. "Finish it, then submit it." "I mean it, Marlene." I finished it on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of April, 2 days before the submission deadline. I hung it from the frame in my living room and stood back and looked at it for a long time. It was not perfect. I could see the places where my hand had been less steady than I'd wanted, the section on the lower left where the tension was slightly off, the seam I had redone 3 times before accepting that it was as good as it was going to get. I could see all of it. I could also see what it was, a real piece of work. Something with intention and feeling and 30 years of technical knowledge running underneath the surface of every decision. Something that was unmistakably mine. I photographed it and submitted it and then stood in my living room for a moment in the particular quiet of a thing completed. My phone rang. Dorothy. Did you submit it? She asked. She knew the deadline. Just now, I said. Good. A pause. How does it feel? I thought about it honestly. Terrifying, I said. And correct. That's the best combination, Dorothy said. I'll make dinner Friday. Celebrate. I'd like that. In early April, before the submission, something else had happened that I want to tell accurately because I think it matters to the full picture of this time. Caleb called on a Tuesday evening, my class night, but he'd forgotten or didn't track it, and I was already home by the time he called at 8:30. He seemed to be in a different place than the carefully managed calls of the preceding months, looser, less rehearsed. Can I ask you something? He said. Sure. Do you remember that Christmas, I think I was maybe 8 or 9, where the radiator broke and we had to use blankets and extra sweaters for like 3 days while you waited for the repair guy? I blinked. It was such an unexpected question that it took me a second to locate the memory. The winter of, it must have been 98. Yes, I remember. I was thinking about that. I'm not sure why. We made hot chocolate and watched movies, and you made it into this, I don't know, this adventure. I thought it was fun. I didn't realize until I was older that you must have been stressed out of your mind. I was, I said. The repair was not cheap, and it was very cold. But you made it fun, he said, for me. A pause. I think about stuff like that sometimes, things I didn't understand until I was older. There were a lot of them. I was quiet for a moment, not from lack of words, but from the need to be careful with them. I did the best I could, I said finally. It wasn't always the right thing, but it was always my best. I know, he said, quietly. I know that. We talked for 40 minutes that night about nothing consequential. Old memories, some of them funny, some of them hard. He told me about a mistake he'd made at work that week, not asking for advice, just telling me the way you tell someone you trust. I told him about the piece I was finishing for the exhibition, described it badly, and made him laugh trying to explain what silk charmeuse was. He said he wanted to see it. Come up sometime, I said. The exhibition is in May. A pause. Yeah, he said, maybe I will. I didn't hold on to that. I had learned not to hold on to maybes. But I noticed that he'd said it. The first week of May, the art center sent notifications. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the email came through. I read it standing up, holding my phone with both hands, and when I finished reading, I put the phone face down on the counter and stood very still for a moment. They wanted to feature my piece, not just include it, feature it. The center director had written personally to say that among the submissions, mine had distinguished itself, and they would like to display it in the primary gallery space and include a small artist statement in the catalogue. I picked up the phone and read the email again. Then I called Dorothy. She answered immediately. What happened? I told her. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a shout. Marlene, she said. Marlene, that is wonderful. That is exactly right. That is exactly what was supposed to happen. I'm shaking, I said. You're allowed to shake, she said. You earned that shake. I called Bet next. She answered already knowing something had happened from the sound of my voice, and when I told her, she said, Of course, obviously, I could have told you that weeks ago. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and I did something I had not done in a long time. I cried. Not from sadness, not from grief, not from any of the feelings that had driven the crying of the past 7 months. I cried from the particular, almost uncomfortable fullness of something good that you weren't entirely sure you still deserved, landing directly on you with all its weight. I had not made the piece for recognition. I had made it for the precise pleasure of making something as close to my exact vision as my hands could manage. But the recognition, the external confirmation that the work had value beyond my own walls, beyond my own private accounting, did something to me that I couldn't have anticipated. It touched a part of me that had been told in subtle and not so subtle ways for longer than felt fair, that what I made and who I was fell short of some unmarked standard. She's not really someone you put in the front row. Use. I sat at my kitchen table and cried for probably 12 minutes, which is longer than I usually allow myself for any single feeling. Then I washed my face and made a second cup of coffee and began drafting my artist statement, which Renata had told me to approach simply and honestly and without performing either modesty or grandeur. I wrote, I have been a seamstress for 30 years. Most of what I have made has been functional. Garments worn on days that matter, alterations that make someone feel right in their own skin. This piece is the first thing I have made purely for the act of making. I hope it carries that intention visibly. I read it back. I changed 2 words. Then I sent it. Outside, the April garden was beginning to wake up. I could see the first green tips of the tulip bulbs pressing through the soil near the fence. Just barely visible. Just enough to confirm they were coming. The alliums would be later. The ranunculus later still, if they came at all. I had been told they were somewhat temperamental in this climate and might not take the first year, but the tulips were coming, that much was certain. I had put them in the dark ground in early spring, and they had done what they were going to do, quietly, without anyone watching, without anyone's permission or approval. That was the thing about growing things. They didn't need you to believe in them to grow. They just needed the conditions. The right soil, the right depth, enough time, enough patience. I had been doing the same thing all these months, quietly, without an audience, putting myself back in the ground I was meant to grow from. Something was coming up. I could feel it. Joan. The exhibition opened on a Saturday in the second week of May. I arrived an hour early, which was not something I had planned to do, but which my body decided for me when I woke up at 5:47 and found I could not go back to sleep. I lay in bed for 20 minutes trying, then gave up, made coffee, and sat in my chair by the window, watching the early light come up over Dunmore Street while the neighborhood was still completely quiet. The tulips were fully open now. They had come in a few weeks prior, exactly as promised. Pushing up through the soil I had turned and the dark I had trusted. The ranunculus had surprised me. Temperamental in this climate, the nursery catalogue had warned, might not take the first year, but there they were, the deep coral ones, 3 clusters of them along the fence, more vivid than the photograph in the catalogue had suggested, improbable and certain, the way good things sometimes are. I dressed carefully, not in something I had made. I had considered it, gone back and forth about it, ultimately decided against the obvious symmetry of it. Instead, I wore a deep burgundy wrap dress I had bought at a small boutique in Savannah on the last afternoon of my trip, because I had walked past the window and stopped and thought, without deliberating, that's the dress. It fit exactly right. I had not altered a single seam. That felt important in a way I didn't entirely know how to articulate. Wearing something I had simply chosen off a rack in a color that was entirely for me, to an event that was entirely for me. No adjustments, no accommodations. I drove to the art center at 8:30 and let myself in through the side entrance with the key Renata had given me. The main gallery was already set up. The other pieces hung and arranged, the lighting adjusted to the particular warm quality that made textile work look most alive. Mine was on the far wall, in the primary position Renata had described in her email. I walked across the empty room and stood in front of it alone. The silk charmeuse piece, the amber copper that caught light, differently depending on the angle. 11 weeks? No, more than that. 50 years of watching my mother sew. 30 years of putting my hands to work in the service of other people's most important days. 7 months of recalibration and grief and quiet. Stubborn insistence on my own right to take up space. All of it was in there, running underneath the surface the way it always does in work made by people who have lived in their craft long enough that the living and the making are not separate things. I stood in front of it for a long time. Then I straightened the small artist statement card on the wall beside it. It didn't need straightening, but my hands needed something to do. And I went to find Renata, who was in the back room making coffee and arguing cheerfully with one of the other instructors about the hanging height of a student's weaving installation. "You're early," Renata said when she saw me. "I couldn't sleep," I said. She handed me a coffee cup. "Good sign," she said. "Means it matters." By 11, when the exhibition officially opened, Dorothy was there. She came in wearing her good wool coat, the one she saved for occasions, and found my piece before she found me, which I discovered when I spotted her standing in front of it with her hands clasped and an expression on her face that I will keep for the rest of my life. When she saw me coming, she opened her arms and I walked into them, and we stood there for a moment, two old women in a gallery, and neither of us said anything because neither of us needed to. Bet arrived 20 minutes later with two women from the class I had not met before. Friends of hers, she explained, who she had told about the exhibition and who had insisted on coming. She introduced them with the expansive warmth of someone who collects people, the way some people collect objects, and is equally proud of the whole collection. The taller of the two women, a retired architect named Constance, stood in front of my piece for a full 2 minutes without speaking. Then she turned and said, "You've been doing this for 30 years, and this is your first exhibition piece." "In this form, yes," I said. She shook her head slowly. "Well, better late than never. But don't wait another 30 years for the next one." The room filled gradually with a particular mix of people and art center exhibition draws. Students and their families, instructors, community members who came to these things regularly, people who had wandered in from the street because the doors were open and the morning was pleasant. Renata gave a short welcome and spoke briefly about the student work, and when she mentioned mine specifically, cited it as the piece I'd most want on my own wall, I felt a heat rise in my face that I recognized distantly as the unfamiliar sensation of being publicly acknowledged for something I had made entirely on my own terms. I was talking to Constance about structural textile work when I heard the door. I heard it before I saw it, the particular sound of the gallery door opening and the slight change in the room's ambient noise that comes when new people enter a space. I was mid-sentence. I finished the sentence. Then I looked toward the door. Caleb was standing just inside the entrance. He was alone. He was wearing the grey jacket I had always liked on him, the one he'd bought for a job interview 6 years ago and which still fit him well. And he was looking around the room with the careful attention of someone who is trying to orient himself. His eyes moved across the space and then found me, and for a moment neither of us moved. He had said maybe. I had not held on to maybes too. And yet here he was, 4 hours from Atlanta on a Saturday morning, standing in the doorway of an art center in a grey jacket, looking at his mother across a room full of work she had made. I excused myself from Constance and walked toward him. He met me halfway, which was not lost on me. "Hey, Mom." His voice was a little uncertain, the way it got when he wasn't sure of his reception. He opened his arms and I stepped into them and he hugged me with both arms, properly, the full body hug of someone who means it. "You came," I said into his shoulder. "I said maybe," he said. "I know maybe isn't great, but I wanted to be here." I stepped back and looked at him. He looked a little tired around the eyes. He had driven up this morning, I guessed, left early enough to make the opening. He was 34 years old, and he looked in this particular light briefly like the 8-year-old who used to come find me in the middle of the night when he had bad dreams. "Vanessa didn't come?" I asked. Plainly, not pointed, just the question. He held my gaze. "She had plans today," he said, "and I thought this was something I should come to by myself." I nodded. I did not press it further. There would be time for more conversations about Vanessa, about what had and hadn't changed, about the slow and imperfect work of building something real after something false had been taken apart. There would be time. This was not the moment for it. "Come see the piece," I said. I walked him across the room. He was quiet as we moved through the exhibition. looking at the other work with real attention, not performing interest, which I noticed. When we reached the far wall, he stopped. He stood in front of the silk charmeuse piece for longer than I expected. I stood beside him and let him look. I had described it to him badly on the phone, made him laugh with my failed explanation of the material, and I was curious what it was actually like for him to see it. "Mom," he said after a while. "Yeah, this is..." He paused. He was not a man who reached for words easily, which was something he had gotten from me. "It's really something. It's really genuinely something." "Thank you," I said. "I didn't know you could..." He stopped. "I mean, I knew you were good at what you do. I've always known that, but I didn't know it looked like this." He gestured at the piece, at the scale of it, the way the amber copper moved in the gallery light. "I didn't know it was this kind of thing." I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I didn't either," I said. "Not until recently." He looked at me then, really looked, in the direct way he sometimes did, that reminded me he was still underneath everything. The child who noticed things, the one who brought tea without being asked. "How are you, Mom, actually?" "Actually," I said, "I'm good, better than I've been in a long time." "Yeah?" A searching look. You seem different, not bad different, just different." "I am different," I said. "I've been doing some work." "What kind of work?" I looked at the piece on the wall. "The kind you do when you stop waiting for permission to be yourself," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'm sorry, Mom, for a lot of things this past year. I keep trying to figure out how to say that properly, and I don't think I've managed it yet, but I'm sorry." This was the closest he had come to a direct, unhedged apology. No qualifications, no pivot to how hard his position had been, no explanation of what he had been trying to manage. Just, "I'm sorry." I looked at my son standing in front of the work I had made, and I felt the love that had always been there, undiminished, frustratingly intact, alongside something new, a clarity, a set of terms that were different from the ones we had been operating on for years, terms that I had written this time. Not terms designed around what I thought he needed from me, but around what was actually true. "I know," I said, "and I love you, but I need you to understand something." I turned to face him fully. "I am not the same person I was a year ago. I'm not going to be that person again. The one who made herself invisible so you wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience of her feelings. That person is done." He nodded slowly. "I know." "Do you?" I asked. Not aggressively, genuinely. "I'm starting to," he said. And the honesty in that, not yes completely, I've figured it all out, but I'm starting to, was the most real thing he had said to me in close to a year. "Okay," I said, "then we have something to work with." We stayed at the exhibition for another 2 hours. Dorothy found us and talked to Caleb with the warm frankness she brought to every human interaction, and I watched him respond to her with the instinctive ease he'd always had with her, going back to childhood when she was just the neighbor lady who gave out full-size candy bars at Halloween. Renata found us and asked Caleb pointed questions about what he saw in the piece, the kind of questions she asked everyone because she believed people could articulate more about art than they thought they could, and he held his own better than I expected. Better made him laugh twice in the first 5 minutes of meeting him, which was approximately Better's average with new people. We had lunch after, just the two of us, at a quiet Italian place 3 blocks from the arts center. We sat across from each other and ordered and talked, and it was not seamless. It was not the easy intimacy of before Vanessa, before Atlanta, before the gradual installation of distance that had happened so gradually I hadn't noticed until I was standing in a hotel room in a dusty rose dress, wondering how I'd ended up on the outside of my own son's life. There were pauses that were slightly long, moments where we were clearly both navigating carefully, 2 people who love each other and have recently hurt each other trying to find the footing of something new. But it was real. That was what it was above everything else. Real and imperfect and ours. At one point, over the pasta, he asked about Savannah. I told him about the textile museum, about Sylvie's shop, about the she crab soup and the cobblestone streets, and the hour I spent just walking without a destination for the first time in my adult life. He listened with the full attention he had as a child, the kind that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. You should go somewhere, I told him. The two of you. Somewhere that isn't a resort with a pool. Somewhere you walk around and get lost. He smiled. Yeah, maybe. Not maybe, I said. Actually, he laughed. Okay, actually. Near the end of lunch, I said something that I had been carrying since February, since the phone call about the investment property, since the moment I had understood fully what my house on Dunmore Street had been reduced to in someone's financial planning conversation. I want you to know, I said, that I've updated my estate documents. Everything is in order. The house, the accounts, all of it. Patricia Osei helped me get it done properly. He looked up from his plate. His expression shifted. A complicated mix of things, some of which I could read and some of which I couldn't. Mom, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, I said. I'm telling you because I think transparency is better than assumptions, and because I think we've both had enough of things not being said directly. I held his gaze. The house is mine. My life is mine. Whatever I choose to do with either of those things will be my decision, made from a position of freedom, not guilt or obligation or someone else's financial timeline. I paused. I'm not saying this to punish you. I'm saying it so we're clear. A silence. We're clear, he said quietly. Good. He drove back to Atlanta that evening. We hugged in the parking lot beside his car, and he held on for a beat longer than the usual goodbye hug, and I let him. Call me, I said when we separated. I will, he said. And then, because he was Caleb and he was 34, and he was, underneath all of it, still the person I had built my life around. Love you, Mom. Love you more, I said, the way I always said it. I watched him pull out of the lot and drive away, and I stood in the May afternoon for a moment before I got in my own car. The thing about that moment, the thing I want to be honest about, is that it was not a Hollywood ending. He didn't arrive with a speech. He didn't confess everything, name every wrong thing, promise to be different in every specific way. I would have written the scene if I were writing it for comfort rather than truth. He drove 4 hours to stand in front of something I made and say, this is really something. And I'm starting to understand, and I'm sorry for a lot of things. That was what happened. And it was enough. Not because I had lowered my standards or because I had decided to accept less than I deserved, but because I had spent 7 months learning the difference between what I needed from Caleb and what I had been trying for years before that to extract from him as proof that my life had been worth what it cost. I didn't need him to complete me anymore. I had stopped needing that. And because I had stopped needing it, what he actually gave me, imperfect, real, more than he had given in a year, landed differently. It landed as what it was, not as what it fell short of. That is a distinction that took me 67 years and 7 very hard months to learn. I don't recommend the curriculum, but I'm grateful for the lesson. 3 weeks after the exhibition, Vanessa called. I did not expect this. I want to say that clearly. I had not been waiting for it, had not been engineering conditions to make it happen, had not spent the intervening weeks hoping. I had been working on a new commission, a custom piece for Sylvie's shop in Savannah. She had seen photographs of the exhibition piece and reached out to ask if I would create something for her gallery wall, which was a surreal and wonderful sentence to read in an email. And I had been having dinner with Dorothy on Thursday evenings and class on Tuesday nights, and an ongoing text chain with Bet that had become a genuine source of daily entertainment. I had been living my life, fully, occupying all of it, not leaving room at the edges for the waiting I used to do. And then Vanessa called on a Tuesday afternoon, and I looked at her name on my screen for 2 full rings, and then I answered. Marlene, my name again, first name. Vanessa, I said. A pause, longer than her usual pauses. She was not as composed as she normally was when she called me, and I could hear that before she said a single word of substance. There was a quality to her breathing, to the silence, that told me she had not prepared a script for this one. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the conversation we had in February." "Which one?" I said, not unkindly, but precisely. She understood what I meant. "The one about the down payment," she said, "and I've been thinking about a lot of things for a while now." Another pause. "I owe you an apology." I waited. "What I said to you about the loan after everything, it was wrong. The way I handled the whole first year of our marriage in terms of how I treated you was wrong. She stopped. I could hear her working for the words, and this time the work was real. Not polished, not professional. Real. "I was threatened by you. I don't entirely understand all the reasons why, but I know I was. And instead of dealing with that honestly, I managed you. I minimized you. I made Caleb feel like choosing you was choosing against me." A pause. "And I said some things about you at the wedding." Her voice changed slightly. "I don't know if you heard them." "The hallway, the door ajar. She's not really someone you put in the front row." "I heard them," I said. She made a sound, small, involuntary. Mortification is its own sound, distinct from other kinds of pain, and I recognized it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I mean that. I'm not calling because Caleb asked me to, or because I think it fixes anything. I'm calling because I've been carrying that around since the wedding, and it needs to be said directly to you by me." I sat with this for a moment. Here is what I felt, honestly. I felt the apology land, not as a relief, not as a vindication. Those would have been the feelings of the woman I was a year ago, the one who needed external accounting to feel justified in her own pain. I felt it land as an act by another human being who had done something wrong and was standing in front of it, which cost something, and that cost was visible in her voice, and I respected the cost. But I also knew, with the clarity that the past 7 months had given me, that an apology is a beginning, not an ending. It closes one kind of debt and opens a different kind of account, one that has to be maintained by behavior over time, not settled in a single phone call. "Thank you," I said. "I mean that. I know I have a long way to go," she said. "In terms of earning trust back, I know that." "You do," I said, "and I'm willing to let you try, genuinely. But I need you to understand something, Vanessa." I kept my voice even. "I am not the same woman you met at that engagement dinner. I'm not the woman who showed up to the wedding trying to earn her seat. I know who I am now in a way I didn't a year ago. And that woman, this woman, she has very clear terms. She won't be managed. She won't be minimized. She won't disappear quietly because her presence is inconvenient. Those terms are not negotiable." A silence. "I understand," Vanessa said. "Then we have a starting point," I said. We talked for 20 minutes. It was not a comfortable conversation. It was not supposed to be. But it was honest in a way nothing between us had ever been before. And honestly, uncomfortable and honest was a considerable improvement over smooth and false. After I hung up, I called Dorothy because Dorothy was the person I called now when things happened that needed to be said out loud to someone who knew the whole story. She apologized, I told her. "Directly?" Dorothy said. "Directly." A pause. "Well," Dorothy said, "that took longer than it should have." "Yes," I said. "What are you going to do with it?" "See if it means anything over time," I said. "Not assume, not hope too hard. Just watch." "That's the right answer," Dorothy said. "I'll make dinner Friday." "You don't have to keep making dinner every Friday, Dorothy." "I know I don't have to," she said, with the patience of someone who has been making this point for years and intends to continue making it. "I want to. You need to stop treating people wanting to spend time with you as a burden you should apologize for." I was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fair point." "I know it is," she said. 7 o'clock, bring wine." I planted the second garden bed in June. New plants, things I had never grown before, chosen purely on the basis of wanting to see them. A climbing rose along the back fence that would take 2 or 3 years to establish fully, which I was at peace with. Herbs along the windowside because I had started cooking more and with more intention, and having my own rosemary and thyme felt like the logical extension of that. And in the center, in the spot I had been considering all spring, a peony bush, a deep magenta variety that would not bloom its first year. Peonies never did. They put all their energy into roots the first year, into the underground work, into establishing themselves in the soil before they produce a single flower. It could take 3 years to see the first bloom. I planted it anyway. I was 67 years old and I planted a peony that wouldn't bloom for 3 years, and I did not find that sad. I found it correct. I submitted the commission piece to Sylvie at the end of June. She called me when it arrived, which I had not expected, and spent 15 minutes on the phone describing exactly where she was going to hang it, and exactly what the light did to it at different hours, and exactly what the customers who had already seen it had said. Her enthusiasm was genuine and professional and a little overwhelming in the best way. I want to talk about a series, she said before we hung up. When you're ready, 4 pieces, maybe 5. A full series for the main wall. A series. I sat with that word for a moment. Not a one-off. Not a single piece submitted under someone else's deadline. A series. My vision, my scale, my terms, my walls. Let me finish what I'm working on, I said. Then yes, let's talk. Caleb called every week now. Not every day, which was never what I had wanted, even in the years when I was reaching for it, saying, but every week reliably, sometimes twice. The calls ran longer than they had in years. He told me things without being prompted. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. He sent me a photograph one Wednesday of a restaurant they had gone to the night before, just a picture of a plate of food with no explanation, which made me laugh because it was such a Caleb thing to do. The impulse to share something without having a reason for it, just wanting to share it. He and Vanessa came to Dunmore Street in July, both of them together for a long weekend. It was the first time Vanessa had been in my house, which sat between us without being addressed. We simply moved around it, 2 people who had said what needed saying on the phone and were now testing whether it held in person. The first evening was careful, all of us slightly formal with each other, navigating the new terms. I made dinner. Nothing elaborate, a roasted chicken and vegetables, a thing I could do without anxiety. And we ate at the kitchen table where Caleb had done his homework for years, and the conversation was sometimes easy and sometimes had the quality of people making a conscious effort. But the second day was better, and the third better than the second. On the last morning, Vanessa came downstairs early while Caleb was still sleeping, and found me in the garden with my coffee, looking at the climber rose establishing itself along the fence. She stood at the back door for a moment, and then she came out and stood beside me, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "What is this one?" "A climbing rose," I said. "It won't really bloom for another season or 2, but I like watching it take hold." She looked at it, really looked in a way I hadn't seen her look at much before, not performing interest, not managing the situation, just looking at a thing because it was there to be looked at. "I like that," she said finally, "planting something you have to wait for." "I've gotten good at it," I said. She nodded. We stood there a little longer, the 2 of us in the early morning garden, and I won't pretend we were suddenly the same kind of easy with each other that I was with Dorothy or Bet or my own reflection in a mirror. We were not. We were 2 women with significant history between them, standing next to each other in a garden, doing the patient and imperfect work of learning how to occupy the same space without one of them disappearing. But we were doing it. And that, the doing of it, the showing up for it without certainty of outcome, was what I had learned to value more than any resolution I could have scripted in advance. When they left on Sunday afternoon, Caleb hugged me in the driveway and said, "We'll come back before the fall." "I'd like that," I said. Vanessa hugged me too. It was brief and slightly awkward, the hug of 2 people who are not yet natural with each other but are committed to getting there. I received it without performing warmth I didn't fully feel yet, and without withholding the warmth I did. That was the balance I was learning. Honesty without cruelty, openness without pretending, farther along than I was. I watched them drive down Dunmore Street, and I stayed in the driveway after the car disappeared, standing in the July morning with my arms folded against the warmth, looking at the house I had lived in for 31 years. I thought about the woman who had stood on the edge of that hotel parking lot 11 months ago, in a dusty rose dress she had made herself, sitting in a rental car for 6 minutes because she didn't know how to hold what had just happened to her. I thought about the woman who had counted call lengths on her phone screen and swallowed things and maintained a smile and told herself she was being reasonable. I thought about what it cost to make yourself small for someone else's comfort, and how the cost doesn't show up on the bill right away. It accumulates quietly year by year until the morning you wake up and don't recognize the shape of your own life. I thought about all of that. And then I went inside and made a second cup of coffee and took it out to the garden and sat in the chair I had put there in the spring. Just a simple wooden chair, nothing expensive, positioned to face the back fence where the climbing rose was slowly, steadily doing its work. And I sat in the July morning and drank my coffee and did not think about anything in particular, just the garden, just the light, just the ordinary sufficient pleasure of a morning that was entirely mine. The peony wasn't blooming yet, it wouldn't for another season or two. But I had looked at it closely that morning, kneeling down with my bad left hand resting on my knee, and I had seen it. The evidence of what was happening underground, invisible and necessary. New growth. The plant taking hold, establishing its roots in the soil I had prepared for it, doing the patient internal work that comes before anything beautiful can break the surface. I was not done becoming. I want to say that clearly as the last thing. I was 67 years old and I was not done. The series for Sylvie's Gallery was in its early stages. The Climbing Rose needed 2 more seasons. The Tuesday classes with Renata continued, and I was getting better in ways I could measure. Dorothy was coming Friday. Betta had started talking about a trip to Portugal in the spring, and had started sending me articles about it in a way that made clear she was already factoring me into the plan. My son called every week. My daughter-in-law and I were building something, slowly, imperfectly, with full knowledge of the foundation we were building it on, which was cracked in places and required care. The house on Dunmore Street was mine, documented and clear, and not a line item in anyone else's financial plan. And I, Marlene Brooks, 67 years old, seamstress and textile artist and person who had spent too long trying to earn the front row of her own life. I was here, fully, firmly, without apology here. She didn't lose her family, she found herself. And in finding herself, she gave them the only real gift she had left to give. A woman they would have to meet honestly, or not at all. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything. End of part 5, end of story.